All right, what's up? We're back. International Financial Practices, page 63, Western Civilization to 1914. Let's see how this goes. The financial principles which apply to the relationships between different countries are in an expansion of those which apply within a single country. When goods are exchanged between countries, they must be paid for by commodities or gold. They cannot be paid for by notes, certificates, and checks of the purchaser's country, since these are of value only in the country of issue. To avoid shipment of gold with every purchase, bills of exchange are used. These are claims against a person in another country which are sold to a person in the same country. The latter will buy such a claim if he wants to satisfy a claim against himself held by a person in the other country. He can satisfy such a claim by sending to his creditor in the other country the claim which he has bought against another person in that other country, and let his creditor use that claim to satisfy his own claim. Thus, instead, importers in one country sending money to exporters in another country. Thus, instead of importers in one country sending money to exporters in another country, importers in one country pay their debts to exporters in their own country, and the creditors in the other country receive payment for the goods they have exported from the exporters in their own country. Thus, payment for goods in an international trade is made by merging single transactions involving two persons into double transactions involving four persons. In many cases, payment is made by involving a multitude of transactions, frequently in several different countries. These transactions were carried out in the so-called foreign exchange market. Okay. An exporter of goods sold bills of exchange. An exporter of goods, there's no comma there. An exporter of goods sold bills of exchange into that market and thus drew out of it money in his own country's units. An importer bought such bills of exchange to send to his creditor, and thus he put his own country's monetary units into the market. Since the bills available in any market were drawn in the monetary units of many different foreign countries, there arose exchange relationships between the amounts of money available in the country's own unit, put there by the importers, and the variety of bills drawn in foreign money and put into the market by exporters. The supply and demand for bills or money of any country in terms of the supply and demand of the country's own money available in the foreign exchange market determined the value of the other country's money in relation to domestic money. These values could fluctuate widely for countries not on the gold standard. So this is what we're getting to. Okay. So basically they got the foreign exchange. You put money in to the foreign exchange and then you get like credit, or you put credit in and then you get money, but it doesn't really matter which country you're in. You always get the money from your country back. And then they're saying if you weren't on the gold standard, that's going to like screw you up, basically, if you're part of the foreign exchange. But only narrowly, as we shall see, for those on gold. See? So if you're on gold, then your currency is more stable, and that way when you do foreign exchanges, you can kind of predict what's going to happen more. Or like, for example, how the British pound was like the most valuable currency in the world for quite a long time until like the dollar, and then it was like fluctuating back and forth between the dollar and the pound and the euro for like a long time. I should probably check on those prices. Under normal conditions, a foreign exchange market served to pay for goods and services of foreigners without any international shipment of money, gold. It also acted as a regulator of international trade if the imports of any country steadily exceeded exports to another country. More importers would be in the market offering domestic money for bills of exchange drawn in the money of their foreign creditor. There thus would be an increased supply of domestic money and an increased demand for that foreign money. As a result, importers would have to offer more of their money for these foreign bills, and the value of domestic money would fall, while the value of foreign money would rise in the foreign exchange market. This rise or fall on a gold relationship would be measured in terms of par, the exact gold content equivalent of the two currencies. As the value of domestic currency sagged below par in relationship to that of some foreign currency, domestic exporters to that foreign country will increase their activities because when they receive payment in the form of a bill of exchange, they can sell it for more of their own currency than they usually expect and can thus increase their profits. A surplus of imports by lowering the foreign exchange value of the importing country's money will lead eventually to an increase in exports. Okay. So lowering the foreign exchange value of the importing country's money will lead to an increase in exports. Okay, so this is like the weak dollar, strong dollar type of theory, where like if the dollar is weak, then we can export more stuff because it's going to cost everybody else less in the world to buy it. And if the dollar is strong, then we can't export as much stuff because it's going to cost them more to buy it, basically. This is like a very complicated way of saying that. Okay. Will lead eventually to an increase in exports, which, by providing more bills of exchange, will tend to restore the relationship of the money back towards par. So that means like they're both balanced in comparison to the price of gold. Such a restoration of parity in foreign exchange will reflect a restoration of balance in international obligations. This in turn will reflect a restored balance in the exchange of goods and services between the two countries. Okay. This means, under normal conditions, that a trade disequilibrium will create trade conditions which will tend to restore trade equilibrium. Okay, so basically, yeah, they're saying it will just go back. If there's an imbalance, then, one of the currencies' price will change, and that will like basically balance out to the price of gold in between those two different currencies. So they're trying to basically use gold as a way to do arbitrage. So then they use gold as the standard so they can figure out how much profit they're making when they exchange one currency from one country to another currency from another country, or these credit bills or whatever they're shifting around. They'll always know the true value based on the value of gold. and then they do arbitrage. So, when you go to like foreign exchanges, like if you need to exchange money when you go to a different country, you always have to pay basically like an interest rate to exchange it. And then there's an exchange rate, which is not always exactly like, it'll be like fractions of a penny or sometimes even like a penny or less than that. But then when you're adding those transactions up over trillions of dollars, then it starts, these guys can make a lot of money like that. Not sure if that's exactly what he's getting at, but that it seems kind of like that's what he's going for. I'm not real familiar with the foreign exchange stuff, but you can always just look that type of stuff up on the internet. Maybe we'll look up later. When countries are not on the gold standard, this foreign exchange disequilibrium, that is, the decline in the value of one monetary unit in relation to the other, can go on to very wide fluctuations, in fact, to whatever degree is necessary to restore trade equilibrium by encouraging importers to buy in the other country because its money is so low in value that the prices of goods in that country are irresistible. See, this is how globalism works, right? Then they shift the factories to a country where, people have less resources or they haven't developed yet. And then, that makes it a low value because, their currency is not as strong against the gold or the foreign exchange as, say a huge country like the United States or super powerful country like Britain or Germany or China or Japan or something like that. But when countries are on the gold standard, the result is quite different. In this case, the value of the country's money will never go below the amount equal to the cost of shipping gold between the two countries. An importer who wishes to pay his trade partner in the other country will not offer more and more of his own country's money for foreign exchange bills, but will bid up the price of such bills only to the point where it becomes cheaper for him to buy gold from the bank and pay the cost of shipping and insurance on the gold as it goes to his foreign creditor. Thus, on the gold standard, foreign exchange quotations do not fluctuate wildly, but only move between the two gold points, which are only slightly above the gold export point and slightly below the gold import point. Parity, the legal gold relationship of the two currencies. So basically, if the currency goes up to the point to where it's worth more than the gold, then that's bad, because then they'll want to get their gold back. And if it goes too far below, then it's going to mess up their currency. So that's why they have to keep it balanced, like in the middle between, but this parity thing where the gold is in between the two currencies. I think that's what he's saying. I'm not a foreign exchange expert. Okay. Since the cost of packing, shipping, and insuring gold used to be about 0.5% of its value, the gold export and import points were about this amount above and below the parity point. In the case of the dollar-pound relationship, when the parity was at £1 to $4.8, yeah, that was like its peak. I mean, when I was over there, it was like $2 to one pound. And I think the euro has almost balanced out, because like at first the euro was like worth like about $1.50, like when it first came out, but I think right now it's like balanced out. Let's actually look at this foreign exchange stuff real quick. Okay. I mean, I don't know how many more sections in this chapter. There's like a chart here and everything, but I think if we look at the internet, it might give us more of a... Okay, there's only like 2 more pages in this section anyway, so... Right. We'll just power through this, and then look at the foreign exchange stuff. All right. Okay, the gold export point was about 4.885, and the gold import point was about 4.845. Thus, gold export point 4.885, excess demand for bills by importers, parity is 4.866, gold import point 4.845, excess bills of supply by exporters. The situation which we have described is overly simplified. In practice, the situation is made more complicated by several factors. Among these are the following. Middlemen buy and sell foreign exchange for present or future delivery as speculative activity. The total supply of foreign exchange available in the markets depends on much more than the international exchange of commodities. It depends on the sum total of all international payments, such as interest payments for services, tourist spending, borrowing, sales of securities, immigrant remittances, and so on. 3. The total exchange balance depends on the total relationship of all countries, not merely between two. The flow of gold from country to country resulting from unbalanced trade tends to create a situation which counteracts the flow. If a country exports more than it imports, so that gold flows in to cover the difference. This gold will become the basis for an increased quantity of money, and this will cause a rise of prices within the country sufficient to reduce exports and increase imports. At the same time, the gold, by flowing out of some other country, will reduce the quality of money there and will cause a fall in prices within that country. These shifts in prices will cause shifts in the flow of goods because of the obvious fact that goods tend to flow to higher priced areas and cease to flow to lower priced areas. These shifts in the flow of goods will counteract the original unbalance in trade which caused the flow of gold. As a result, the flow of gold will cease and a balanced international trade at a slightly different price level will result. So it's like basically once the currency gets too high in one country, then the other country will just start buying stuff from them, and then the gold will start to go to the other country, starting because it'll be cheaper for them to buy gold because they have a higher value currency, and then that will shift. Then they'll start buying the gold up until the point where the demand or whatever reaches that their currency now is too expensive to buy gold, and that's when they stop. And then that's what causes the balance. I think that's what he's saying. Again, not a foreign exchange expert. The whole process illustrates the subordination of internal price stability to stability of exchanges. It was this subordination which was rejected by most countries after 1931. This rejection was signified by A. Abandonment of the gold standard, at least in part. B. Efforts at control of domestic prices, and C. Efforts at exchange control. All these were done because of the desire to free the economic system from the restricting influence of a gold-dominated financial system. Yeah, because then they can just dump cash, or well, not like cash, but like, currency into the system from their reserves on that M3 money supply where we don't know how much money they have. They just have all this cash in reserves, right? They can just dump money into the foreign exchange and pump up one currency and then play another country. That's what they do. It's like a pressure system where they keep moving the thing around, and then wherever they move it, the differential is where the profit is. and then they just keep moving it from one country to the other country, and then shifting it and dumping currency and taking out all the currency. Because how they take out all the currency basically is by doing foreclosures, and stuff like that. Like, say you got a car note, and then they just repo your car. That's how they bring back in currency. Or you have a house, and then you go into bankruptcy, and you have foreclosed on your house. You have to sell it to the bank, right? That's how they get the money back, in that way. Okay. By 1900, and were largely wiped away as a result of the economic changes brought by the First World War. Because of these changes, it became impossible to restore the financial system which had existed before 1914. Efforts to restore it were made with great determination, but by 1933 they had obviously failed, and all major companies had been forced to abandon the gold standard and automatic exchanges. When the gold standard is abandoned, gold flows between countries like any other commodity, and the value of foreign exchanges, no longer tied to gold, can fluctuate much more wildly. In theory, an unbalance of international payments can be rectified either through a shift in exchange rates or through a shift in internal price levels. On the gold standard, this rectification is made by shifts in exchange rates only between the gold points. When the unbalance is so great that exchanges would be forced beyond the gold points, the rectification is made by means of changing internal prices caused by the fact that gold flows at the gold points instead of the exchanges passing beyond the gold points. On the other hand, when a currency is off the gold standard, fluctuations of exchanges is not confined between any 2 points, but can go indefinitely in either direction. In such a case, the unbalance of international payments is worked out largely by a shift in exchange rates and only remotely by shifts in internal prices. In the period of 1929 to 1936, the countries of the world went off the gold standard because they preferred to bring their international balances towards equilibrium by means of fluctuating exchanges, rather than by means of fluctuating price levels. They feared these last because changing, especially falling prices, led to declines in business activity and shifts in the utilization of economic resources such as labor, land, and capital from one activity to another. The establishment of the balance of international payments when a currency is off gold can be seen from an example. If the value of the pound sterling falls to $4 or $3, Americans will buy in England increasingly because English prices are cheap for them, but Englishmen will buy in America only with reluctance because they have to pay so much more for American money. This will serve to rectify the original excess of exports to England, which gave the great supply of pound sterling necessary to drive its value down to $3. Such a depreciation in the exchange value of a currency will cause a rise in prices within the country as a result of the increase in demand for the goods of that country. Okay. So such a depreciation in the exchange value of a currency will cause a rise in prices within that country. Oh, because they're going through like a deflation or inflation. Okay. As a result, the increase in demand for the goods of that country. Yeah, because it's inflation. Okay. All right, that was that. The next one is the situation before 1914. Get ready, yo. This is gonna be real good. All right, let's look at this foreign exchange stuff. All right. All right, let's check this out. What does that mean? This is a really like detailed chart telling me exactly what this is, and I mean, what the hell is this? All right, not a good website for that. Oh, British pound, $2. Um, no, that's not what we're looking for. Okay. These are all just like real foreign exchanges. They're not gonna have like the history of it. Okay, let's try chart maybe. I know it's spelled foreign, but I know it as I-R-I-G. No, it's not much. Okay, chart. Okay, how do you fucking spell it? I-G-N. Okay, I-G-N. Okay. Can I get like one? Okay. I chose the pound and the dollar. Okay. Okay, see, it says the longer the bar, the weaker the currency against the dollar. The shorter the bar, the stronger the currency against the dollar. It looks like. Alright, okay, which one is that? UK. So you notice how the countries that we import most of the stuff from, they have a weak currency, right? And that's part of China's problem, right? They can't raise their currency past a certain amount. Like they could probably surpass us
if they really wanted to, but they can't, because then it won't be beneficial for us to like buy stuff for all the like European countries and Western countries to buy stuff from China and to buy stuff from Mexico, right? So their money is basically artificially deflated for the purpose of them being able to do trade with the other countries. And so you can see how there is kind of a benefit to having a weaker currency, because then it's going to make it more likely that other countries are going to want to buy your imports, right? And so since we have such a strong currency, that's kind of part of the reason of what's causing all the inflation, is because no one else in any other country can afford to buy the things that Americans produce, right? So it makes it so that we can't export goods and things like that, right? Because our goods are too expensive. That's why it's like they have to actually just like basically make bribery deals with China and other countries to buy our soybeans and buy our steel and buy all this other stuff, because it's too expensive for them. In reality, there's no reason why they would buy it. Okay. This looks kind of interesting. See, the British pound has been constantly falling compared to the dollar, at least since 1976. Going towards that equilibrium point. All right, let's see the euro versus the dollar. All right. Is this the euro or the dollar? Okay, so $1. See how the euro, it started off lower, and then as more and more countries like join the European Union, it gets stronger and stronger, and now it's up to. See, that's how it was. It's like that's not quite $1.50, but it was like less than $1. And now it goes up, and now it's almost reached complete equilibrium. I think, yeah, it was around that time, or yeah. So it just, all the currencies kind of reach equilibrium, and then they play around in between the countries shifting. So it's like all this tariff stuff is really advanced. Like, you're gonna need some like pretty high level math people and economists to really figure this out. Like, this is definitely not my thing that I can be explaining fully like this. I just kind of get the gist of, foreign exchanges. It's basically like a lot of arbitrage stuff, where it's like they're changing the value, and then you see how they're playing the currencies off each other. And since now they're off the gold standard, it's just based on how much trade each country is doing with the other country to reach these trade balances, because that's what it seems like they're trying to do. That's what it seems like Trump's doing with that stuff, where, he's promising to take a bunch of their students and take a bunch of their people for different jobs in exchange for them buying a bunch of soybeans and other American products, probably like luxury goods and things like that, even though they make most of the luxury goods in China. But you can see that that's basically what it looks like Trump's trying to do, is reach one of these trade balances to where, you know, the dollar is strong, but we're not paying too much. And, you know, China's going to be slightly weaker, but they're going to have to take some of our goods to reach a balance. That's what seems like's going on. And that kind of seems like what he's talking about. But still, you can see how that's a very powerful position to be in, these people that can control these type of exchanges. And like I said, with that third layer of money, they can just dump in as much money into the system as they want at any time, or pull out as much money into any system as they want at any time by calling on people's credit. And then they can basically predict, even though, you know, you shouldn't be able to predict this, but they can predict, quote unquote, by them manipulating the price. And then they can make profits off of the differential between the prices of the different currencies in the exchange. And so that kind of gives them a lot of power, because say, you know, for instance, it's like sanctions. You know, if a country's not doing what the United Nations or global government wants them to do, then they can put trade sanctions on their country, stopping other people from trading with them. And then that's going to cause inflation in their country, because then they're going to have too many goods, right? And too many products or whatever. And they won't have anyone to sell them to because they're sanctioned. And then that's going to cause inflation in their country. And then it's going to lower production because they're going to have overproduction, right? And all that type of stuff. So you can just kind of get the gist of, you know, how well, in theory, this is fine. You know, if it was just a regular thing and countries were just exchanging currencies. But once you realize that these people have like this higher level of ability to manipulate all of this stuff, and then they can profit even from like shorts, which is amazing, where you can actually profit from the price falling as long as you have the proper prediction of where it's going to stop. And then you can bet on that. And then you're just exchanging like not currencies, but you're exchanging stocks or other types of credit notes. Like they're talking about these bills of credit, bonds, and things like that. And so the bond is just one bond or one stock. It doesn't matter. It's not the value of it. So then you just get the profit through the differential of the price shifting. And that's what it's kind of like a pressure system, where if everything's stagnant, then there's no profit to be made. So there's that they have to keep it constantly shifting from one value to another, just slightly, but not enough to completely ruin all of the markets in the world, but just enough so it's slightly shifting and ever shifting. And there's just these gaps where there's price differentials, and then that's how they make their money through it. And that's also how they can control the system by, you know, causing inflation in one country or deflation, calling on credit or issuing credit, right? So basically that's what they're getting at. I think I'm not the best person to explain this, like I said before. So, all right. Let's just go through this section here. All right.
The situation before 1914. The key to the world situation in the period before 1914 is to be found in the dominant position of Great Britain. This position was
real than apparent. This position was more real than apparent. In many fields, such as naval or financial, the supremacy of Britain was so complete that it almost never had to be declared by her or admitted by others. It was tacitly assumed by both. As an unchallenged ruler in these fields, Britain could afford to be a benevolent ruler. Sure of herself and of her position, she could be satisfied with her substance rather than forms. If others accepted her dominance in fact, she was quite willing to leave them independent. She was quite willing to leave to them independence and autonomy in law. This supremacy of Britain was not an achievement of the 19th century alone. Its origins go back to the 16th century, to the period in which the discovery of America made the Atlantic more important than the Mediterranean as a route of commerce and a road to wealth. In the Atlantic, Britain's position was unique, not merely because of her westernmost position, but much more because she was an island. This, in fact, made it possible for her to watch Europe embroil itself in internal squabbles while she retained freedom to exploit the new worlds across the seas. On this basis, Britain had built up a naval supremacy which made her ruler of the sea by 1900s. Along with this was her preeminence in merchant shipping, which gave her control of the avenues of world transportation and ownership of 39% of the world's ongoing vessels. 39%, 40%. 3 times the number of her nearest rival. To her supremacy in these spheres, one in the period before 1815, Britain added new spheres of dominance in the period after 1815. These arose from her early achievement of the Industrial Revolution. This was applied to transportation and communication as well as to the industrial production. In the first, it gave the world the railroad, the steamboat. In the second, it gave the telegraph, the cable, and the telephone. In the third, it gave the factory system. The Industrial Revolution, I was going to say, didn't we invent the telephone? Britain didn't invent the telephone. America did. The Industrial Revolution existed in Britain for almost 2 generations before it spread elsewhere. It gave a great increase in output of manufactured goods and a great demand for raw materials and food. It also gave a great increase in wealth and savings. As a result of the first two and the improved methods of transportation, Britain developed a world trade of which it was the center and which consisted chiefly of the export of manufactured goods and the import of raw materials and food. At the same time, the savings of Britain tended to flow out to North America, South America, and Asia, seeking to increase the output of raw materials and food in these areas. By 1914, these exports of capital had reached such an amount that they were greater than the foreign investments of all other countries put together. In 1914, British overseas investment was about 20 billion, or about 1/4 of Britain's national wealth, yielding about 1/10 of the total national income. The French overseas investment at the time was about 9 billion, or 1/6 of the French national wealth, yielding 6% of national income, while Germany had about 5 billion invested overseas, 1/5 of the national wealth, yielding 3% of national income. The United States at that time was a large-scale debtor. The dominant position of Britain in the world of 1913 was, I have said, more real than apparent. In all parts of the world, people slept more securely, worked more productively, and lived more fully because Britain existed. British naval vessels in the Indian Ocean and the Far East suppressed slave raiders, pirates, and headhunters. Small nations like Portugal, the Netherlands, or Belgium retained their overseas possessions under the protection of the British fleet. Even the United States, without realizing it, remained secure and upheld the Monroe Doctrine behind the shield of the British Navy. Okay, we gotta look at what the Monroe Doctrine is. Small nations were able to preserve their independence in the gap between the great powers, kept in a precarious balance by the foreign office's rather diffident balance of power tactics. Okay. Small nations were able to preserve their independence in the gaps between the great powers. Most of the world's great commercial markets, even in commodities like cotton, rubber, and tin, which she did not produce in quantities herself, were in England, the world price being set out. Some of this weight right in this. Okay, most of the world's commercial markets were in England, the world price being set from the auction bidding of skilled specialist traders there, so stock traders, right? If a man in Peru wished to send money to a man in Afghanistan, the final payment, as like as not, would be made by a bookkeeping transaction in London. So we're going to get into like the double booking type of stuff and all that. The English parliamentary system and some aspects of the English judicial system, such as the rule of law, were being copied as best as could be in all parts of the world. The profitability of capital outside Britain, a fact which caused the great export of capital, was matched by a profitability of labor. As a result of the flow of capital from Britain and Europe was matched by a flow of persons. Both of these served to build up non-European areas on a modified European pattern. An export of men, as an export of capital, Britain was easily first, over 20 million persons immigrating with an E from the United Kingdom in the period of 1815 to 1938. As a result of both, Britain became the center of the world finance as well as the center of the world commerce. The system of international financial relations, which we described earlier, was based on the system of industrial, commercial, and credit relationships, which we have just described. The former thus required for its existence a very special group of circumstances, a group which cannot be expected to continue forever. In addition, it required a group of secondary characteristics which were also far from permanent. Among these were the following. 1. All countries concerned must be on the full gold standard. 2. There must be freedom from public or private interference with the domestic economy of any country. That is, prices must be free to rise and fall in accordance with the supply and demand for both goods and money. See, we're missing that. 3. There must also be a free flow of international trade so that both goods and money can go without hindrance to those areas where each is most valuable. So basically, this is like laissez-faire stuff, where it's like if you try to put too much tariffs or block too much stuff, it's going to mess it up. 4. The international financial economy must be organized about one center with numerous subordinate centers so that it would be possible to cancel out international claims against one another in some clearinghouse and thus reduce the flow of gold to a minimum. 5. The flow of goods and funds in international matters should be controlled by economic factors and not be subject to political, psychological, or ideological influences. These conditions, which made the international financial and commercial system function so beautifully before 1914, had begun to change by 1890. The fundamental economic and commercial conditions changed first and were noticeably modified by 1910. The group of secondary characteristics of the system were changed by the events of the First World War. As a result, the system of early international financial capitalism is now only a dim memory. Imagine a period without passports or visas and with almost no immigration or customs restrictions. Yeah, that's like the Ellis Island type of period, or even before Ellis Island, where people would just move freely basically because there was no welfare, so nobody really cared. But then when it's like you have a taxation system where you go around collecting money from everybody and then you give it to people coming into the country without passports, it kind of sucks. But I can see how it worked fine then because, there was no welfare really. Certainly, the systems had many incidental drawbacks, but they were incidental. Socialized, if not social, civilized, if not cultured, the system allowed individuals to breathe freely and develop their individual talents in a way unknown before and in jeopardy since. All right, so the next chapter or section is going to be the United States to 1917. All right, okay. Okay. Just as classical culture spread westward from the Greeks who created it to the Roman peoples who adopted it and changed it, so Europe's culture spread westward to the New World, where it was profoundly modified while still remaining basically European. The central fact of American history is that people of European origin and culture came to occupy and use the immensely rich wilderness between the Atlantic and the Pacific. In this process, the wilderness was developed and exploited area by area. The Tidewater, the Piedmont, the Trans-Appalachian Forest, the Trans-Mississippi Prairies, the Pacific Coast, and finally the Great Plains. By 1900, the period of occupation, which had begun in 1607, was finished, but the era of development continued on an intensive rather than extensive basis. This shift from extensive to intensive development, frequently called the closing of the frontier, required a readjustment of social outlook and behavior from a largely individualistic to more cooperative basis, and from an emphasis on mere physical prowess to emphasis on other less tangible talents of managerial skills, scientific training, and intellectual capacity able to fill
newly occupied frontiers with a denser population producing a higher standard of living and utilizing more extensive leisure. The ability of the people of the United States to make this readjustment of social outlook and behavior at the ending of the frontier, about 1900s, was hampered by a number of factors from its earlier historical experience. Among these, we should mention the growth of sectionalism, past political and constitutional experiences, isolationism, and emphasis on physical prowess and unrealistic idealism. The occupation of the United States had given rise to three chief geographic sections: a commercial and later financial and industrial East, an agrarian and later industrial West, an agrarian South. Unfortunately, the two agrarian sections were organized quite differently. The South on the basis of slave labor and the West on the basis of free labor. On this question, the East allied with the West to defeat the South in the Civil War in 1861 to 1865 and to subject it to a prolonged military occupation as a conquered territory 1865 to 1877. Yes, that was a war and it was bad. The Southerners got treated horribly in that war. Since the war and the occupation were controlled by the new Republican Party, the political organization of the country became split on a sectional basis. The South refused to vote Republican until 1928, and the West refused to vote Democrat until 1932. In the East, the older families, which inclined towards the Republican Party because of the Civil War, were largely submerged by waves of new immigrants from Europe, beginning with the Irish and Germans after 1846, and continuing with even greater numbers from Eastern Europe and Mediterranean Europe after 1890. These new immigrants of the eastern cities voted Democrat because of religious, economic, and cultural opposition to the upper classes. The upper class Republicans of the same eastern section. So basically, sounds very similar to what's going on today, where people are voting in socialism. It's basically the lower class people. I don't want to say they're like lower class, but lower income people. I think that's a better, The class basis in voting patterns in the East and the sectional basis in voting in the South and West proved to be of major political significance after 1880. The Founding Fathers had assumed that the political control of the country would be conducted by men of property and leisure who would generally know each other personally, and facing no need for urgent decisions would move government to action when they agreed and be able to prevent it from acting without serious damage when they could not agree. Consensus. The American Constitution, with its provisions for division of powers and selection of the chief executive by an electoral college, reflected this point of view. So also did the use of party caucus of legislative assemblies for nomination to public office and the election of senators by the same assemblies. The arrival of a mass democracy after 1830 changed this situation, establishing the use of party conventions for nominations and the use of entrenched political party machines, supported on the patronage of public office, to mobilize sufficient votes to elect their candidates. So basically, that's when they started doing political campaigns to get votes. As a result of this situation, the elected officials from 1840 to 1880
found himself under pressure from three directions: from the popular electorate, which provided him with the votes necessary for election; from the party machine, which provided him with the nomination to run for office, as well as the patronage appointments by which he could reward his followers; and from the wealthy economic interest which gave him the money for campaign expenses, with perhaps a certain surplus for his own pocket. This was a fairly workable system, since the three forces were approximately equal, the advantage, if any, resting with the party machine. This advantage became so great in the period between 1865 and 1880 that the forces of finance, commerce, and industry were forced to contribute ever-increasing largesse to the political machine's bribes in order to obtain the services from government which they regarded as their due. Services such as higher tariffs, land grants to railroads, better postal services, and mining or timber concessions. Right? We see a lot of that, right? The mining and timber concessions. That's what Trump is getting with China, and the higher tariffs, right? The fact that these forces of finance and business were themselves growing in wealth and power made them increasingly restive under the need to make constantly larger contributions to party political machines. Moreover, these economic tycoons increasingly felt it to be unseemly that they should be unable to issue orders, but instead have to negotiate as equals in order to obtain services or favors from party bosses. Okay, so the big money people didn't like the fact that basically the people that controlled the party, the Democrat and Republican Party, had more power over the politicians than they did. By the late 1870s, business leaders determined to make an end to this situation by cutting, with one blow, the taproot of the system of party machines, namely the patronage system. This system, which they called by the derogatory term spoils system, was objectionable to big business, not so much because it led to dishonesty or inefficiency, but because it made the party machines independent of business control by giving them a source of income. You see, like, that's where it always goes, right? Then they've got to use their money to take over every system so that they're in full control. And then it just gives the illusion of the old system, right? It just gives the illusion that the party still has some type of say, and that candidates are just naturally getting elected or nominated. Come on, okay. So they called it the spoil system, the system where at least, the Democrat Party could receive donations from, citizens that wanted to support the Democrat Party, and then they could run the candidates that they want. Big business didn't like that. If this source could be cut off or even sensibly reduced, politicians would be much more dependent upon business contributions for campaign expenses at a time when the growth of mass press and of the use of charter trains for political candidates were greatly increasing the expense of campaigning for office. Any reduction in campaign contributions from office holders would inevitably make politicians more subservient to business. It was with this aim in view that civil service reform began in the federal government with the Pendleton Bill of 1883. As a result, the government was controlled with varying degrees of completeness by the forces of investment banking and heavy industry from 1884 to 1933. This period, 1884 to 1933, was the period of financial capitalism in which investment bankers moving into commercial banking and insurance on one side and into railroading and heavy industry on the other were able to mobilize enormous wealth and wield enormous economic, political, and social power, popularly known as society. As the society, or the 400. They lived a life of dazzling splendor, sailing the ocean in great private yachts or traveling on land by private trains. They moved in ceremonious round between their spectacular estates and townhouses in Palm Beach, Long Island, the Berkshires, Newport, and Bar Harbor. Isn't Bar Harbor in Maine? I'm not sure. Yeah, I think so. I think that's a place where the Hinkley factory is, actually. Okay. Assembling from their fortress-like New York residence to attend Metropolitan Opera under the critical eye of Miss Astor, or gathering for business meetings of the highest strategic level in the awesome presence of J.P. Morgan himself. The structure of financial controls created by the tycoons of big banking and big business in the period of 1880 to 1933 was of extraordinary complexity, one business fief being built on another, both being allied with semi-independent associates, the whole rearing up into two principles of economic and financial power, of which one centered in New York, was headed by J.P. Morgan and Company. Notice they were there at the censorship thing. J.P. Morgan and Chase is still there at the censorship thing, censoring the internet. I might pull up that video later and talk about it more, but yeah. When the whole censorship thing came out, and it was like the misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation thing, J.P. Morgan was Chase, the bank company, was basically at every single meeting that they had, that the government had about that topic, right? So you can see how it's the same plan. People keep going, oh, well, how could this go on for centuries and centuries and it'd be the same people doing it? That's how. They just make sure that they're always at the business meeting. Like forever. Company, and the other in Ohio was headed by the Rockefeller family. When these two operated as they generally did, they could influence the economic life of the country to a large degree and could almost control its political life, at least on the federal level. The former point can be illustrated by a few facts. In the United States, the number of billion-dollar corporations rose from 1 in 1909, United States Steel, controlled by Morgan, to 15 in 1930. The share of all corporations' assets held by the 200 largest corporations rose from 30% in 1909 to 49% in 1930 and reached 50% by 1939. By 1930, these 200 largest corporations held 49.2% of the assets of all 40,000 corporations in the country. 81 billion out of 161 billion. They held 38% of all business wealth, incorporated or unincorporated, or 81 billion out of the 212 billion. And they held 22% of all the wealth in the country, or 81 billion out of 367 billion. In fact, in 1930, one corporation, American Telephone and Telegraph, AT&T, controlled by Morgan, had greater assets than the total wealth in 21 states of the Union. Wow. So they had this stuff on lock. Basically, in the 1930, it was a wrap. They they already had more money than 21 of the states. Just Morgan's telephone company, AT&T, had more money than half of the states basically could produce. Just one corporation. Not even just one corporation, just one aspect of the JP Morgan Chase Corporation. That was just one aspect. That was just the telegraph and telephone part. And then plus they own the oil, and they own the steel, and they own the railroads, and they own the factories, and they own everything. And then when you're born, you have to work for them. Right? And then your parents kick you out of the house when you turn 18 and force you to work for them. And you're like, why was I born? Why was I even fucking born? The influence of these business leaders was so great that Morgan and Rockefeller groups acting together, or even Morgan acting alone, could have wrecked the economic system of the country merely by throwing securities on the stock market for sale. See what I'm saying? That level 3, that third layer of money, right? They could have wrecked the economic system of the country merely by throwing securities on the stock market, right? So all this M3 money layer or whatever that they don't take account of, they can use that to just throw it into the stock market and literally destroy the country. So of course they have more power than the politicians. The politicians technically need your vote to approve anything that they do. These guys are completely private. They can just take their stock money and just dump it, pump it or dump it, and basically threaten politicians. Hey, you don't want to do what we say? Well, we might just do a pump and dump on your entire economy. And then everybody goes broke. 2008, anyone? And having precipitated a stock market panic, could then have bought back the securities they had sold but at a lower price, shorting the market. Naturally, they were not so foolish as to do this, although Morgan came very close to it in precipitating the panic of 1907. But they did not hesitate to wreck individual corporations at the expense of the holders of common stocks by driving them to bankruptcy. See, they'll bankrupt you if they don't like you. In this way, to take only 2 examples, Morgan wrecked the New York, New Haven, and Hartford Railroad before 1914 by selling to it at high prices the largely valueless securities of myriad New England steamship and trolley lines. And William Rockefeller and his friends wrecked the Chicago, Milwaukee, St. Paul, and Pacific Railroad before 1925 by selling to it at excessive prices plans to electrify the Pacific Copper, electricity, and a worthless branch railroad, the Gary Line. But these are but examples of the discovery by financial capitalists that they made money out of issuing and selling securities rather than out of the production, distribution, and consumption of goods, and accordingly led them to the point where they discovered that the exploiting of an operating company by excessive issuance of securities or the issuance of bonds rather than equity securities not only was profitable to them, but made it possible for them to increase their profits by bankruptcy of the firm, providing the fees and commissions of reorganization as well as the opportunity to issue new securities. So that's like corporate takeover type stuff.
When the business interest led by William C. Whitney pushed through the first installment of civil service reform in 1883, they expected that they would be able to control both political parties equally. Indeed, some of them intended to contribute to both and to allow an alternation of the two parties in public office in order to conceal their own influence. Oh my god. I mean, do we gotta keep reading this? Come on. Indeed, some of them intended to contribute to both and allow an alternation of the parties in public office in order to conceal their own influence, inhibit any exhibition of independence by politicians, and allow the electorate to believe that they were exercising their own free choice. Do we really have to read any more? Such an alternation of the parties on the federal scene occurred in the period between 1880 and 1896, with business influence, or at least Morgan's influence, as great in Democratic as in Republican administrations. But in 1896 came the shocking experience. The business interests discovered that they could control the Republican Party to a large degree, but could not be nearly so confident of controlling the Democratic Party. The reason for this difference lay in the existence of the Solid South as a Democratic section with almost no Republican voters. This section sent delegates to the Republican National Convention, as did the rest of the country, but since these delegates did not represent voters, they came to represent those who were prepared to pay their expenses to the National Republican Convention. In this way, you see what I'm saying? It's like you can't fix politics. It's like it was literally born this way. This is how politics exist, right? It's like political determinism. It's like this is how politics was born. It's in its DNA. It's in politics' DNA. In this way, these delegates came to represent the business interest of the North, whose money they accepted. Mark Hanna has told us in detail how he spent much of the winter of 1895 to 1896 in Georgia, buying over 200 delegates for McKinley to the Republican National Convention of 1896. As a result of this system, about a quarter of the votes in the Republican Convention were controlled votes from the Solid South, not representing the electorate. After the split in the Republican Party in 1912, this portion of delegates was reduced to about 17%. The inability of the investment bankers and their industrial allies to control the Democratic Convention of 1896 was a result of the agrarian discontent of the period 1868 to 1896. This content in turn was based very largely on the monetary tactics of the banking oligarchy. So they're just running everything from behind the scenes. Right? It's literally the Matrix, right? Or like Dark City or something like that, where they're just running everything from behind the scenes. You think one thing's happening, it's not happening. They're picking the politicians. They're telling the politicians what to do. They put the politicians in front of you. You vote for the politicians. It doesn't matter which politician you vote for. And then when everything goes south, they tell you, well, you voted for it. It's laid out right here. It's all laid out right here on page 73 of the book called Tragedy and Hope, which is written by a guy named Carroll Quigley. We are on the chapter Western Civilization
to 1914, page 73, it's a complete admission that the bankers run the political system. Hold on, I gotta do this work stuff real quick. All right. The inability of the investment bankers and their industrial allies to control the Democratic Party of 1896 was a result of the The bankers were wedded to the gold standard for reasons we have already explained. Accordingly, at the end of the Civil War, they persuaded the Grant administration to curb the post-war inflation and go back on the gold standard. Crash of 1873 and resumption of specie payments in 1875. This gave the bankers a control of the supply of money which they did not hesitate to use for their own purposes. As Morgan ruthlessly pressurized Cleveland in 1893 to 1896. The bankers' affection for low prices was not shared by the farmers, since each time prices of farm products went down, the burden of farmers' debts, especially mortgages, became greater. Moreover, farm prices being much more competitive than industrial prices and not protected by a tariff fell much faster than industrial prices. And farmers could not reduce cost or modify their production plans nearly so rapidly as industrialists could. Yeah, because I mean, if you're a farmer and you got a set amount of animals or set amount of acres for crops, that's pretty much it. I mean, what else are you going to do? I mean, you can try efficiency models, but most farmers are already trying to be as efficient as possible. I think for the most part, an industrial farmer like that is usually pretty efficient as far as land usage goes with the technology of the time. So, and then a factory, they can hire cheaper and cheaper and cheaper labor, use cheaper and cheaper and cheaper products, cut corners, cut costs, raise prices, raise taxes, all these different things that they can do to, increase efficiency for their production. Where a farmer, it's pretty much all you could do is get like better fertilizer, more water, or some type of crop or animal that grows either faster or multiplies like more rapidly. The result was a systematic exploitation of the agrarian sectors of the community, right? That's going back to the beginning, right? Where it's like they always sacrifice the farmers and the low income people in order to supply the machines to build the like bigger like industrial part of the society. And by the financial and industrial sectors. This exploration took the form of high industrial prices and high and discriminatory railroad rates, high interest charges, low farm prices, and a very low level of farm services by railroads and the government. Unable to resist by economic weapons, the farmers of the West turned to political relief, but were greatly hampered by their reluctance to vote Democrat because of their memories of the Civil War. Instead, they tried to work on the state political level through local legislation, so-called Granger laws, and set up third-party movements like the Greenback Party in 1876 or the Populist Party in 1892. By 1896, however, agrarian discontent rose so high that it became to overcome the memory of the Democratic role in the Civil War. The capture of the Democratic Party by these forces of discontent
under William Jennings Bryan in 1896, who was determined to obtain higher prices by increasing the supply of money on a bimetallic rather than gold basis, presented the electorate with an election on a social and economic issue for the first time in generations. It's interesting because this is kind of like what's going on now, where a lot of the people that were kind of like the working class Democrats or the kids of the working class Democrats were moving over to Republican because of the jobs being so horrible. But then you also have this upper elite class of like super wealthy Republicans that are kind of represented by like Trump, and their interests are like this international banking and business stuff, right? It's like very similar. It's almost like it's the same thing. Like it's definitely rhyming there. Though the forces of high finance and of big business were in a state of near panic, by a mighty effort involving large-scale spending, they were successful in electing McKinley. The inability of plutocracy to control the Democratic Party, as it had demonstrated it could control the Republican Party, made it advisable for them to adopt a one-party outlook on political affairs, made it advisable for them to adopt a one-party outlook on political affairs. Two sides of the same coin, two wings of the same bird, right? Although they continued to contribute to some extent to both parties and did not cease their efforts to control both. In fact, on two occasions, in 1904 and in 1924, J.P. Morgan was able to sit back with a feeling of satisfaction to watch a presidential election in which the candidates of both parties were in his sphere of influence. In 1924, the Democratic candidate was one of his chief lawyers, while the Republican candidate was the classmate and hand-picked choice of his partner, Dwight Morrow. Usually, Morgan had to share this political influence with other sectors of the business oligarchy, especially with the Rockefeller interest, as was done, for example, by dividing the ticket between them in 1900 and 1920. The agrarian discontent, the growth of monopolies, the oppression of labor, and the excesses of Wall Street financiers made the country very restless in the period of 1890 to 1900. All of this could have been alleviated merely by increasing the supply of money sufficiently to raise prices somewhat. But they didn't do that. But the financiers in this period, just 30 years later, were determined to defend the gold standard no matter what, and looking about for some issue which could distract public discontent from domestic economic issues. What better solution in a crisis in foreign affairs? Cleveland had stumbled upon this alternative more or less accidentally in 1895 when he stirred up a controversy with Great Britain over Venezuela. Come on, you can't make this stuff up. Can't make it up. The great opportunity, however, came with the Cuban revolt against Spain in 1895, while the Yellow Press, led by William Randolph Hearst, roused public opinion. Henry Cabot Lodge and Theodore Roosevelt plotted how they could best get the United States into the fracas with Venezuela. They got the excuse they needed when the American battleship Maine was sunk by a mysterious explosion in Havana Harbor and false flag. Anyone? Oh, come on. In 1898. They got the excuse they needed when the American battleship Maine sunk by a mysterious explosion. Sunk by a mysterious explosion. Okay, we got it. And then they went to war 2 months later. In 2 months, the United States declared war on Spain to fight for the Cuban independence. The resulting victory revealed the United States as a world naval power, established it as an imperialist power with possession of Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. Whetted some appetites for imperialist glory and covered the transition from the long drawn age of semi depression to a period of prosperity. This new period of prosperity was spurred to some extent by the increased demand for industrial products arising from the war, but even more by the new period of rising prices associated with the considerable increase in the world production of gold from South Africa and Alaska after 1895. America's entrance upon the stage as a world power continued with the annexation of Hawaii in 1898, the intervention in the Boxer Uprising in 1900, the seizure of Panama in 1903, the diplomatic intervention in the Russo-Japanese War in 1905, the round-the-world cruise of the American Navy in 1908, the military occupation of Nicaragua in 1912, the opening of the Panama Canal in 1914, the military intervention in Mexico in 1916. During this same period, there appeared a new movement for economic and political reform known as progressivism. The progressive movement resulted from a combination of forces, some new, some old. Its foundation rested on the remains of agrarian and labor discontent, which had struggled so vainly before 1897. There was also a kind of afterthought on the part of successful business leaders, a weakening of acquisitive selfishness, and a revival of the older sense of social obligation and idealism. To some extent, this feeling was mixed with a realization that the position and privileges of the very wealthy could be preserved better with superficial concessions and increased opportunity for the discontent to blow off steam than form any policy of binding obstructionism on the part of the rich. There we go. That's the plan right there. Bread and circuses so that you don't ever vote the bastards out. Right? See what it says. There was also, as a kind of afterthought on the part of successful business leaders, a weakening of acquisitive with an A selfishness and a revival of the older sense of social obligation and idealism. To some extent, this feeling was mixed with a realization that the position and privileges of the very wealthy could be better preserved with superficial, notice how they say superficial concessions, right? They give you a chat GPT while they have AI that can basically do anything, right? They give you, a video game while they have computers that make them smarter, right? It's like they just give you like the lowest level stuff, like the scraps of what they're actually building and doing, and they're like, right? So the very wealthy, so the position and privileges of the very wealthy could be better preserved. I think I need a post-it note for this page, actually. Hold up. Whoops. One second. All right, I got the post-it notes here.
put it on an upside down post-it note on this page because this is definitely important, I think. Okay. I gotta get out of here in a little bit, but I think how many more pages is it? It's like 2 more pages. Okay. Okay. So it's basically what you hear what he's saying, right? He's saying that they're just going to make some superficial concessions, basically not keep all of the 100% of their monopoly money to themselves. They'll let a little bit out just so everybody's able to blow off steam, right? But not do anything to form a policy of obstructionism, meaning obstruction means to block, block the flow of something. So to block the rich, right? So bread and circuses, right? They rather give you something to blow off steam than for you to actually get together and say, hey, we don't want these rich people. As an example of the more idealistic impulse, we might mention the creation of various Carnegie foundations to work for the universal peace or extend scholarly work in science and social studies. As an example of the more practical point of view, we might mention the founding of the New Republic, a liberal weekly paper by an agent of Morgan financed with Whitney money in 1914. Somewhat similar to this last point was the growth of the new liberal press, which found it profitable to print the writings of muckrakers and thus expose to the public eye the steamy side of big business and of human nature itself. But the great opportunity for the progressive forces arose from a split within big businesses between the older forces of financial capitalism led by Morgan and the newer forces of monopoly capitalism organized around the Rockefeller bloc. As a consequence, the Republican Party was split between the followers of Theodore Roosevelt and of William Howard Taft, so that the combined forces of the liberal East and agrarian West were able to capture the presidency under Woodrow Wilson in 1912. Wilson roused a good deal of popular enthusiasm with his talk of the new freedom and the rights of the underdog, but his program amounted to little more than an attempt to establish on a federal basis those reforms which agrarian and labor discontent had been seeking on a state basis for many years. Wilson was by no means a radical. After all, he had been accepting money for his personal income from rich industrialists like Cleveland Dodge and Cyrus Hall McCormick during his professorship at Princeton, and this kind of thing by no means ceased when he entered politics in 1910. And there was a good deal of unconscious hypocrisy in many of his resounding public speeches. Be this as it may, his political and administrative reforms were a good deal more effective than his economic or social reforms. The Clayton Antitrust Act and the Federal Trade Commission Act, both 1913, were soon tightly wrapped in litigation and futility. On the other hand, the direct election of senators, the establishment of an income tax and Federal Reserve system, and the creation of Federal Farm Loan System in 1916, and the rural delivery of mail and parcel postage. That's good, as well as the first steps toward various laboring enactments like minimum wages for merchant seamen, restrictions on child labor. That's good. An 8-hour workday. That's good for railroad workers. Justified the support which progressives had given to Wilson. Yeah, you vote for that sounds good, but then you vote for them and then you give them power over you, but you don't have to vote for them to have an 8-hour workday. You just don't, that's between you and the business. That doesn't have anything to do with politicians, right? Your wages don't really have anything to do with politicians. Child labor doesn't really have anything to do with politicians. A society can just decide on its own that we don't want to, like, think about it. Do they really have to enforce child labor laws nowadays? I mean, maybe in some places, but in the United States, most people are not going to hire children. Like, just not even because it's the law. Like, at this point, it doesn't need to be enforced, right? This is a social thing. Everybody knows, hey, maybe it's not a good idea to force like a 5-year-old to work in a mine. Okay. Maybe some people don't know that, though. I don't know. It's hard to tell these days. The first administration of Wilson, 1913 to 1970, and the earlier administration of Theodore Roosevelt, 1901 to 1909, made a substantial contribution to the process by which the United States redirected its aims from extensive expansion of physical frontiers to an exploitation of its natural and moral resources. The earlier Roosevelt used his genius as a showman to publicize the need to conserve the country's natural resources, while Winston, in his own professorial fashion, did much to extend equality of opportunity to wider groups of the American people. These people were so absorbed in the controversies and engendered by these efforts that they hardly noticed the rising international tensions in Europe or even the outbreak of war in August 1914 until by 1915 the clamorous controversy of the threat of war quite eclipsed the older domestic controversies, and by the end of 1915 America was being summoned in no gentle fashion to play a role on the world stage. This is a story to which we must return in a later chapter. Okay, that was page 77. Oh man, section 3 is going to be the Russian Empire. Wow, this is going to be great. How long is that? Oh my god. Alrighty. Alright. Get out of here. You can check the link for the PDF. It's in the description. Otherwise, have a good day and peace.